When a wealthy couple laughs at Shaq for simply buying groceries, they think they're proving their superiority. But when karma strikes back in real time, their smug arrogance turns into public humiliation. And Shaq does the last thing they ever expected. With the entire store watching, one simple act of kindness flips the power dynamic, leaving them ashamed, speechless, and forever changed. A gripping, emotional story about privilege, humility, and the moment that no one in that store will ever forget. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, letting in a blast of cold air-conditioned air as Big Shaq stepped inside Merrick's Market, an upscale grocery store known for catering to the city's wealthiest residents. The polished floors gleamed under the soft lighting, and rows of meticulously arranged organic produce stretched before him. The place smelled of fresh herbs, baked bread, and overpriced indulgence. Shaq wasn't here for any of that. He wasn't the kind of guy to obsess over brand-name balsamic vinegar or hand-massaged kale. He just needed a few essentials: eggs, orange juice, maybe some fresh salmon if it looked good. Just a simple grocery run. Or at least, that's what he thought. Shaq had barely made it past the produce section when he heard it, the sound of laughter. Not the warm, everyday kind. This was the mean-spirited, hushed type, laced with mockery and arrogance. His grip on the shopping basket tightened slightly, but he didn't turn around. He knew when people were talking about him, and he knew when they wanted him to hear it. Trent and Vanessa Carter stood near the artisan cheese display, a perfectly polished couple draped in designer clothing. Trent, tall and broad with slicked-back chestnut hair and a tailored navy blue blazer, smirked as he whispered something to Vanessa. She let out a delicate, condescending laugh, flipping her platinum blonde hair over one shoulder. Her diamond earrings sparkled under the store's lighting, a sharp contrast to the cold glint in her eyes. Vanessa leaned in closer, voice just loud enough to carry across the aisle. "Didn't know they took food stamps here." Shaq exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. Here we go. He wasn't new to this. Growing up, he had been followed around in stores, assumed to be security risk number one by shop owners who didn't know him but thought they did. Even after making his first million, even after running his own successful businesses, even after buying properties in neighborhoods where people like him weren't expected to live. This nonsense? It still followed him. He could feel Trent and Vanessa watching him, waiting for some kind of reaction. He refused to give them one. Instead, he calmly reached for a bag of oranges, tossing them into his basket without hesitation. Their laughter continued. "Probably trying to figure out what all this stuff is," Trent mused, plucking a bottle of aged olive oil from the shelf and waving it like a trophy. "Think he even knows how to use this?" Vanessa giggled. "Doubt it." A few other shoppers glanced their way, some uncomfortable, others pretending not to notice. Shaq rolled his shoulders, letting the tension settle in his muscles. He could shut this down real quick. One look, one well-placed sentence, and he could have Trent stammering and Vanessa's smug smile wiped clean off her face. But he wasn't about to entertain two clowns who thrived on their own ignorance. So, he did the worst thing possible in their eyes. He ignored them. He continued down the aisle, unbothered, grabbing a carton of eggs and a pack of fresh salmon. Trent and Vanessa exchanged a glance. They weren't used to being ignored, and they sure as hell weren't done yet. As Shaq made his way to the dairy section, their whispers followed him like a shadow. Maybe he's lost. Think they have a clearance section for him? He should try the corner store where his kind usually shops. This time, a few people actually turned their heads. An older woman near the yogurt section frowned, shifting uncomfortably. A younger man, probably in his 20s, tensed up, looking like he wanted to say something but ultimately choosing silence. Shaq wasn't surprised. Most people don't stand up to people like Trent and Vanessa. They just shake their heads and walk away. Shaq had been doing the same thing his whole life. But today, something about this moment felt different. He grabbed his last item, a fresh loaf of whole wheat bread, and turned toward the registers. He was done with this nonsense. But Trent and Vanessa weren't. They sped up, moving toward the checkout line ahead of him, cutting in front without hesitation. Vanessa flashed the cashier a practiced, dazzling smile, placing their overflowing cart onto the conveyor belt. Shaq stopped behind them, silent, patient. And then, Trent turned and smirked. "Hope you got enough for that, big guy." Shaq stared at him, unreadable. A thick pause settled between them, tension crackling like static. Vanessa nudged her husband playfully. "Be nice, honey. Maybe he worked overtime for this trip." More laughter, more smug glances. Shaq let out a slow breath, rolling his neck like a fighter preparing for a match. He wasn't about to argue. He wasn't about to stoop to their level. But what happened next? It wasn't his choice. Because Karma had just entered the chat. The cashier, a young worker named Jake, scanned Trent and Vanessa's groceries with swift efficiency. Bags of imported coffee, bottles of French wine, gourmet cheeses stacked like trophies. Jake hit the total. $432.79. Trent pulled out his black platinum credit card, flashing another smirk at Shaq before handing it over. Shaq knew it before anyone else. That card was about to betray him. Declined. The machine beeped loudly, flashing the red warning like a neon slap to the face. Trent frowned, then swiped again. Declined. Vanessa laughed nervously, shifting from foot to foot. "Try the other one." Jake stayed quiet, but his eyes flickered with something close to amusement. Trent pulled out a second card, swiped, declined. Shaq raised an eyebrow. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. The once smug couple stood frozen, embarrassment slowly creeping in like an unwanted guest. People in line started whispering. The older woman from the yogurt section nudged her friend, whispering something under her breath. The younger man who had stayed silent earlier, now he was watching closely. Vanessa's face turned red with humiliation. "This is ridiculous. We have money." Trent cleared his throat, trying to maintain what little dignity he had left. It's just a bank error." Shaq tilted his head. "That right?" Trent didn't respond. And in that moment, Shaq made a decision. One they never saw coming. He stepped forward, reached into his pocket, pulled out his own sleek black card, and offered to pay for their groceries. Silence, thick, unrelenting. Trent's entire face drained of color. Vanessa looked like she'd been physically slapped. And the people watching? They were never going to forget this moment. Shaq looked at the stunned cashier and said the one sentence that turned the entire store upside down. "Run it." And just like that, the humiliation had only begun. The polished floors gleamed under the bright overhead lights, reflecting the neatly arranged produce and towering shelves of overpriced gourmet items. The air smelled of freshly baked bread, citrus, and the kind of wealth that made ordinary things seem unattainable. Shaq wasn't here for the luxury. He grabbed a bottle of fresh-pressed orange juice, the glass cool in his hands. Nothing fancy, nothing extra. Just what he needed. But even as he moved, he could feel them. Trent and Vanessa. They weren't just watching him, they were hunting for a reaction. From the corner of his eye, Shaq saw Vanessa wrinkle her nose as she eyed his basket. She leaned into her husband, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the air. "Guess food stamps cover organic now." Trent snorted, shaking his head as if Shaq had just walked into the wrong neighborhood. Think he even knows how to cook any of this? Vanessa's perfectly manicured nails traced over a bottle of imported balsamic vinegar, as if touching it made her superior. She sighed dramatically. Probably just buying whatever looks expensive. Shaq didn't flinch, didn't even glance in their direction. He reached for a carton of eggs, checked the label, and placed it in his basket. That should have been the end of it. But people like Trent and Vanessa, they didn't like being ignored. The couple trailed behind him, pushing their cart at a leisurely pace, as if this was all just a casual outing. But their voices carried. "Maybe he's lost," Vanessa mused, inspecting a bottle of truffle oil she had no intention of buying. Trent smirked. "Maybe he's looking for the clearance aisle." Shaq exhaled through his nose, forcing his grip to relax around his basket. Not today. Not for them. A few shoppers cast quick, nervous glances, their discomfort evident. A woman in her late 50s clutched her purse tighter, shifting further down the aisle. A young man in a baseball cap standing near the deli section tensed slightly, as if contemplating saying something, but ultimately choosing silence. No one wanted to get involved. No one wanted to be next. Shaq grabbed a pack of fresh salmon and placed it in his basket. Vanessa scoffed, shaking her head. What's he even doing here? Trent grinned, nudging her. Charity work. Probably thinks being in here makes him look successful. Shaq rolled his shoulders, letting the tension settle. He'd been down this road before, knew exactly where it led, and he wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. They moved into the bakery section, where rows of fresh baguettes and golden croissants filled the air with the scent of butter and warmth. Shaq reached for a loaf of whole wheat bread. Trent chuckled, watching him. Gotta stay healthy, huh? Can't mess up that physique. Vanessa grinned, playing along. Oh, don't be mean, babe, she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. I'm sure he's just trying to treat himself, live like us, for a day. Shaq paused, just for a fraction of a second. That was all they needed. Vanessa's eyes lit up. Trent smirked, sensing victory. They thought they had gotten to him. Shaq took a slow breath. Then he smiled. A small, knowing smile. And that smile? It scared them more than anything else. He turned to face them fully for the first time, his eyes calm but sharp, unwavering. Y'all got a lot of free time, huh? Vanessa's expression twitched. Trent scoffed, trying to recover. We're just making conversation, Shaq chuckled. That what you call it? A couple nearby pretended to browse the pastry selection, their ears clearly tuned in. Vanessa flipped her hair over her shoulder, regaining her usual arrogance. We were just wondering why you're here, that's all. Shaq tilted his head slightly, considering the question. Then he said, because I can be. Silence. For the first time, they didn't have a response. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably. Well, you don't have to be rude about it. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Oh, so now it's rude. Trent stepped forward, his smirk faltering just a little. Relax, man. No need to get sensitive. Shaq let out a slow, measured exhale, the weight of the moment pressing in. He could say something. He could put them in their place right here, right now. But that wasn't his job. That was Karma's job. And Karma was about to clock in. Shaq turned away, heading for the checkout. Trent and Vanessa, still smug despite the crack in their confidence, followed him. And as they did, Shaq already knew what was about to happen. Because the universe? It had perfect timing. The couple cut in front of him at the register, unloading their cart with dramatic flourishes, as if reclaiming control. Vanessa shot him one last smirk. Hope you got enough for that, big guy. Shaq stayed silent. The cashier, a young worker named Jake, scanned their items swiftly. Bags of imported coffee, gourmet cheeses, French wines. The kind of things they bought to remind themselves they were better than everyone else. The total flashed on the screen. $432.79. Trent smirked, pulling out his sleek black platinum card, flashing it for effect before handing it over. Shaq didn't even need to see it. He already knew how this was about to go. Declined. The beep rang louder than it should have. Trent's smirk froze. Vanessa's expression tightened. A few people behind them shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift. Jake, the cashier, hesitated. Looks like that didn't go through. Trent cleared his throat, sliding the card again. Declined. Vanessa laughed nervously, brushing hair from her face. Oh, just use the other one. Trent pulled out a second card, swiped, declined. Silence. Thick. Unrelenting. A couple in line whispered. The young man from earlier, the one who had stayed silent, tilted his head slightly, watching now. Vanessa's face turned red, her hands gripping the counter as if it could somehow undo this. Trent cleared his throat, forcing a smile. It's just a bank issue. Happens all the time. Shaq tilted his head slightly. That right? Trent didn't respond. And that's when Shaq made his move. One they never saw coming. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his own sleek black card, and offered to pay for their groceries. Silence. Trent's entire face drained of color. Vanessa looked like she had been physically slapped, and the people watching, they were never going to forget this moment. Shaq turned to the stunned cashier and said the one sentence that would haunt Trent and Vanessa forever. Run it. And just like that, The real humiliation had just begun. The checkout lanes stretched ahead, each one a neatly organized line of polished counters, bright LED screens, and uniformed cashiers ringing up purchases with robotic efficiency. Shaq approached the shortest line, basket in hand, ready to be done with this trip. But just as he reached the register, they stepped in front of him. Trent and Vanessa Carter. Still smug. Still laughing. Still acting like they owned the place. Trent barely glanced at him as he cut ahead, tossing a box of imported chocolates onto the conveyor belt like he had just won a prize. Vanessa let out a soft chuckle, waving her hand dramatically. "Oh, honey, we almost forgot the wine." She turned to Shaq, giving him a mock-sweet smile. "Ladies first," she purred, then let out a light, condescending laugh. Shaq said nothing. But his silence, it was louder than their laughter. The cashier, a young worker named Jake, looked up, blinking between them. He couldn't have been older than 22, his shaggy brown hair peeking from under his store cap, his hands frozen mid-scan. He knew what had just happened. Everybody did. But he also knew his job didn't pay him enough to say anything. Shaq could see it, the nervous twitch in the kid's jaw, the way he hesitated before continuing the transaction. Vanessa leaned on the counter, inspecting her manicured nails. "Go ahead, sweetheart," she told Jake with a smirk. "We're in a bit of a rush." Jake swallowed hard, nodded, and started scanning their items. Shaq let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders. He wasn't about to argue, wasn't about to make a scene. Because people like Trent and Vanessa, they thrived on baiting people into anger. And the worst thing he could do to them was not care. Trent reached into his cart, pulling out more expensive items with exaggerated care. Aged balsamic vinegar, Wagyu beef, a bag of coffee beans so exclusive it came with a tiny certificate of authenticity. He leaned slightly toward Shaq, voice low but pointed. "Hope you got enough for that, big guy." Shaq's jaw tightened, but his expression didn't change. The words hung between them, thick with meaning, thick with unspoken history. This wasn't just about groceries. It was about power. It was about who gets to belong and who doesn't. And Trent? Trent thought he belonged more. Jake kept scanning. Beep, beep, beep. The total climbed. $125.64. $236.92. $391.10. Then finally, $432.79. Trent grinned, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his sleek black platinum card, flicking it against the counter for effect. With a single glance, Shaq already knew. This was about to go very, very wrong. Trent swiped the card. The machine beeped sharply. Jake glanced at the screen, then back at them. Looks like that didn't go through." Vanessa laughed lightly, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, just run it again." Trent forced a chuckle. Yeah, probably just a chip error." Swipe, beep, declined. Shaq stayed silent. Jake shifted awkwardly. A few customers turned their heads, sensing the shift in energy. Vanessa's smile tightened. "Just use the other one, babe." Trent pulled out a second card, swiped, beep, declined. The moment stretched painfully. Vanessa's fingers curled around the edge of the counter, her nails digging into the polished wood. Trent cleared his throat, his confident posture wilting by the second. The whispers started. A woman behind Shaq, probably in her 50s, nudged her friend. "Would you look at that?" A teenage girl snickered under her breath. Trent's face darkened. His world, the world where he was always the one looking down, was collapsing. Jake cleared his throat. I can try one more time if you want." Trent's jaw clenched. "Do it." Jake swiped. Beep. Declined. Silence. Thick. Suffocating. Unforgiving. Vanessa turned pale. Trent shifted his weight, his hands clenching into fists, but there was nowhere to direct his anger. He could feel the eyes on him now. The same way Shaq had felt their eyes on him earlier. The same humiliation. The same judgment. Only now, it was his turn to be the spectacle. Shaq exhaled slowly, watching without a word. He could have walked away, could have let them stand there in their own mess. But instead, he did the one thing they never saw coming. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his own sleek black card, and offered to pay. Trent's entire face drained of color. Vanessa stiffened, her lips parting in shock. Jake's eyes widened, looking between them. And the people watching? They were never going to forget this moment. Shaq held out the card calmly, his face unreadable. "Run it." Jake hesitated. "Sir, are you sure?" "Run it." The machine beeped once, then the screen flashed. Approved. A sharp, humiliating silence followed. Shaq turned to Trent, expression still cool, still unreadable. "You're welcome." Trent's jaw locked. Vanessa looked like she wanted to sink into the floor, but there was nothing left to say, because the power had shifted, and Shaq never had to say a word. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting a harsh glow over the polished checkout counters. The scent of freshly baked bread lingered in the air, mixing with the sterile, corporate clean aroma of the high-end grocery store. Trent and Vanessa stood at checkout lane 5, their cart overflowing with imported wines, gourmet cheeses, and overpriced organic produce. Shaq stood behind them, his basket much smaller, his posture relaxed. He wasn't in a rush. But Trent and Vanessa? They were about to be. Jake, the young cashier, scanned their items one by one, each beep of the register slicing through the tense silence like a ticking clock. Beep, aged Parmesan. Beep, bottled spring water from the Swiss Alps. Beep, handcrafted dark chocolate, because of course. The total climbed higher and higher, flashing across the screen in crisp, unforgiving numbers. Jake swallowed hard, eyeing the grand total. $432.79. Trent, still riding high on arrogance, pulled out his sleek black platinum card, flashing it for effect before sliding it across the register. Shaq already knew, before anyone else. This was about to go very, very wrong. Jake ran the card. Beep, declined. Trent froze. Vanessa's smirk flickered for just a second, but she recovered quickly, rolling her eyes. "Ugh, babe, it's probably just the chip." Trent forced a chuckle. "Yeah, try it again." Jake hesitated, then swiped. Beep, declined. The moment stretched painfully. A few customers turned their heads, sensing the shift in energy. The older woman behind Shaq, the same one who had looked uncomfortable earlier, now watched with subtle, growing interest. A teenage girl near the next lane nudged her friend, whispering. The balance of power was shifting, and Trent could feel it. His face darkened. Vanessa let out a forced laugh, flipping her hair over her shoulder like the weight of embarrassment wasn't pressing down on them both. "Oh, just use the other one, babe." Trent pulled out a second card, swiped. Beep, declined. The whispers grew louder. Jake shifted uncomfortably, his fingers hovering over the keypad. Trent's shoulders tensed. His easy confidence was slipping, his grip on control weakening by the second. Vanessa's smile was gone now. She leaned toward her husband, voice sharp. "What's going on?" Trent's jaw clenched. "I don't know." But he did know. And so did Shaq. Jake cleared his throat. I can try one more time if you'd like." Trent nodded stiffly, his movements no longer smooth, no longer calculated. Jake swiped. Beep. Declined. Silence. Thick. Suffocating. Unforgiving. Vanessa's fingers curled around the edge of the counter, her nails digging into the polished wood. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, voice rising. "We have money." Shaq tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Yeah?" he mused. "Don't look like it." Trent's hands clenched into fists, his face burning with pure humiliation. The customers behind them? They were no longer pretending not to watch. They were invested. Jake hesitated. "Would you like to try another form of—" "Just give me a second." Trent cut him off, his voice tight, desperate. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, quickly opening his banking app. Shaq watched as the color drained from his face. And just like that, Trent Carter knew. The account was empty. The credit was maxed. And his humiliation was just beginning. Vanessa snatched the phone from his hands, eyes scanning the screen frantically. She gasped. Trent didn't look at her. Didn't look at anyone. But he could feel the weight of every stare. The same weight Shaq had felt earlier. The same humiliation. The same judgment. Only now, it was his turn to be the spectacle. The older woman behind Shaq tilted her head slightly, muttering under her breath. A young man in a baseball cap, the same one who had stayed silent earlier, smirked now. And Vanessa? She was spiraling. "This doesn't make sense," she hissed. We just made a transfer this morning." Trent's jaw locked. Shaq let out a slow breath. He could walk away, could let them stand there in their own mess. But instead, he did the one thing they never saw coming. He stepped forward, reached into his pocket, pulled out his own sleek black card, and offered to pay. Trent's entire face drained of color. Vanessa looked like she had been physically slapped. Jake's eyes widened, looking between them. And the people watching? They were never going to forget this moment. Shaq held out the card calmly, his face unreadable. "Run it." Jake hesitated. "Sir, are you sure?" "Run it." The machine beeped once. Then the screen flashed. Approved. The finality of that word hit harder than anything Shaq could have said. Vanessa staggered back, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Trent looked frozen, as if his mind hadn't yet processed how fast his world had crumbled. Shaq slid his card back into his wallet, never breaking eye contact. Then slowly, he smirked. "You're welcome." Trent's hands twitched at his sides, but there was nothing left to say. Because the power had shifted, and Shaq never had to say a word. The store fell silent. Not the comfortable kind. Not the kind where people paused to check their shopping lists or casually browse the aisles. This was thick, suffocating silence. The kind that wrapped around Trent and Vanessa like a noose, pulling tighter with each passing second. The once laughing, self-assured couple now stood frozen at the register, their faces flushed with humiliation. They weren't laughing anymore. Trent's jaw clenched so tightly, Shaq thought he might crack a tooth. His hands curled into fists, but not in a way that meant violence. In a way that meant control was slipping through his fingers, and he had no idea how to stop it. Vanessa, usually poised and polished, looked lost. Her fingers trembled around her designer handbag, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the leather, as if holding on to something expensive could save her from this moment. Shaq watched, silent, just waiting. Because he knew what was coming next. Pride before acceptance, denial before surrender. It was always the same. Trent let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking his head as if this were some bad joke. He turned to Vanessa. "Forget it. We don't need this." He grabbed for the bags, his movements jerky, slamming them back into the cart as if he could erase what had just happened by leaving fast enough. Vanessa, humiliated beyond words, grabbed her purse and muttered, "Let's just go." But before they could bolt, Shaq's voice cut through the air. Calm, steady, final. "It's not about the money." Trent's movements halted. Shaq took a slow step forward, his expression unbothered, relaxed, but piercingly sharp. It never was. Trent's eyes snapped to his, filled with frustration and something else. Something he wouldn't dare admit. Shaq continued, voice smooth but loaded with something heavier. "It's about what kind of person you choose to be." Trent's breathing was uneven now. The words landed harder than a punch ever could. Because they weren't just words. They were a mirror. And Trent didn't like what he saw. The onlookers, the same people who had stayed silent earlier, were now fully invested. The older woman near the yogurt aisle nodded slightly, as if silently agreeing. The younger man in the baseball cap, who had pretended not to care before, smirked slightly now, amused by the shift in power. Even Jake, the cashier, stood a little taller behind the counter, his discomfort replaced by something else. Something close to admiration. Because this was justice. Vanessa, still clutching her bag, cleared her throat, desperate to regain control. "Well," she muttered, her voice thinner than before. "This has been—" Shaq cut her off. "We're done here." His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't loud, but it was final. And Vanessa knew it. Trent swallowed, his throat working against his pride. He wanted to say something sharp, something cruel, something that would let him claw back even a shred of his lost dignity. But nothing came. Because what do you say when the person you tried to belittle just paid for your groceries? What do you say when the man you mocked walked away with all the power? Trent had no words. He had lost. Shaq grabbed his own bag, just one compared to their overflowing cart. He gave one last glance, his expression unreadable. Then, with the same calm, effortless presence he had walked in with, he turned and left. As he stepped through the automatic doors, the cool evening air hit his face. The tension of the store, the weight of everything that had just happened, melted behind him. Because Shaq had already moved on. But Trent and Vanessa, they never would. The air inside the grocery store felt different now. Before, the silence had been thick with judgment, with whispers hidden behind smirks, with people looking but never truly seeing. Now the silence carried weight. Not the weight of power. The weight of shame. Shaq was gone. His presence had left the store, but his impact hadn't. The people who had pretended not to hear Trent and Vanessa's insults earlier were now wide-eyed, whispering, shaking their heads. A woman near the deli section, mid-50s, silver hair, sharp eyes, muttered under her breath, "That's what kindness looks like." Her husband nodded, adjusting his glasses. "And that's what karma looks like." Near the checkout, a young mother stood with her daughter, who couldn't have been older than 6. The little girl, clutching a stuffed bear in one hand and her mother's fingers in the other, tilted her head curiously. "Mommy," she asked, her voice innocent but curious, "why were they so mean to him?" Her mother hesitated, glancing toward Trent and Vanessa, who stood paralyzed in their humiliation. She chose her words carefully. "Because some people think they're better than others, until life reminds them they're not." Trent still hadn't moved. His fingers gripped the edge of the checkout counter, his jaw locked, his once confident smirk completely wiped away. He could feel the eyes on him now. People weren't just watching, they were judging, the same way he had judged Shaq. And suddenly, he knew what it felt like to be on the other side of that gaze. For the first time, he looked small. Vanessa, still clutching her designer purse like it could somehow protect her, was the first to break. She couldn't take it. The whispers, the stares, the realization that this moment would live far beyond the walls of this store. With a sharp inhale, she snatched one of the bags off the counter, her hands trembling as she stuffed the receipt inside. "Let's go." Trent didn't move. She turned to him, her voice sharper. "Trent, I said let's go." But he couldn't. Because Trent, for all his arrogance, for all his privilege, for all his years of looking down on people like Shaq, had never felt this before. This sinking, gut-wrenching awareness that he wasn't untouchable, that he wasn't better, that he had been put in his place, not with fists, not with rage, but with kindness. And that stung the most. Vanessa exhaled sharply, her frustration boiling over. "God, Trent, let's just leave. Who cares what these people think?" But she knew the truth. She cared, because once upon a time they had been the ones judging. Now, they were the joke. Trent finally moved, but not in the way Vanessa expected. He turned slightly, his eyes scanning the store, landing on the exit where Shaq had just walked out. For the first time, there was no hatred in his expression, no bitterness, just a quiet, unsettled realization. A realization that the world he thought he ruled was much bigger than he ever imagined. Vanessa shook her head, scoffing as she grabbed the rest of their bags. Without waiting for him, she stormed toward the exit, heels clicking against the polished floors. Trenta. He followed, but slower, quieter. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like the most important person in the room. Because now, nobody was looking at him with admiration. They were looking at him with pity. The air inside the grocery store wasn't the same anymore. It was thicker, heavier, charged with something that hadn't been there before. Not tension, not conflict, reality. Shaq stood calm, steady, his presence still towering even though he wasn't the one holding the power anymore. Trent, who once moved through the store like he owned it, now stood frozen at the register, gripping the counter like it was the only thing keeping him upright. His breathing was uneven. His knuckles were white. For the first time, he wasn't the one looking down. He was the one being looked at. And he knew it. Shaq took a step forward. Not aggressive, not threatening. Just enough to close the space between them. Trent barely lifted his head, his pride still trying to salvage whatever was left. Shaq exhaled slowly, his voice steady, deep, unshaken. I never needed your respect. The words hit harder than any insult ever could. Trent flinched slightly, but he stayed silent. Shaq held his gaze, not with anger, not with hatred, but with something far worse. Disappointment. The crowd watched closely, their eyes darting between the two men. A moment ago, Trent had been untouchable. Now he looked small. Shaq didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just let the next words settle in, making sure Trent heard them. But maybe now, you'll understand what it feels like to be looked down on. Trent's throat tightened. There were 100 things he could have said, a comeback, a defense, a weak excuse. But none of them mattered, because nothing he said could erase what had just happened. Nothing could take away the fact that for once, he had been powerless, and the man he tried to belittle had just left him standing in his own shame. Shaq watched him for a moment longer. Then, just like that, he turned away. Not in anger, not in triumph, in closure. His footsteps were slow, measured, echoing against the polished floors as he made his way toward the exit. No rush, no urgency, because he had nothing to prove. He had already won. The automatic doors slid open with a quiet whoosh, the cool night air rushing in to meet him. As he stepped outside, the store behind him buzzed with whispers. But Shaq? He didn't need to hear them, because this moment wasn't for him. It was for Trent, and Trent would never forget it. The store wasn't the same anymore. Shaq was gone, but his presence still lingered, woven into the air, etched into the faces of the people who had just witnessed something they'd never forget. There was no grand explosion, no violent confrontation, no shouting match. And yet, what had just happened shook the room more than any fight ever could. The whispers started immediately. At first, they were hushed, uncertain. But then, they grew. A woman in a navy blue coat shook her head, exhaling. Damn, that was something. Her husband nodded, rubbing his chin. That man's got more patience than I ever would. Near the bakery section, a group of young women stood close together, their shopping carts momentarily forgotten. Did you see how calm he was? One of them asked, almost in awe. I was waiting for him to snap. Didn't need to. He walked out of here with all the power. And that? That was what made it unforgettable. At the front registers, Jake, the young cashier, was still standing stiffly, gripping the edge of the counter. His heart was still racing. He had never seen anything like that before. And if he was being honest, he wasn't sure he ever would again. A co-worker, a girl named Sarah, nudged him. Dude, what just happened? Jake let out a breath, shaking his head. I have no idea. Sarah glanced toward the exit where Shaq had disappeared. That guy, he really paid for them? Jake scoffed. Yeah, and the dude looked like he wanted to sink into the floor after it. He ran a hand through his hair, still trying to process it all. It's crazy. Like, that guy could have just left, could have let them suffer. He let out a small, almost disbelieving chuckle. But instead, he paid for their groceries. Sarah folded her arms, shaking her head. That's what real power looks like. Jake nodded slowly, and deep down he knew. He'd be telling this story for a long time. Not far away in aisle 6, the young mother from earlier knelt beside her daughter, adjusting the hood on her little pink coat. But the little girl? She wasn't focused on her jacket. She was still thinking. Her small hands tugged at her mother's sleeve. Mommy? The woman looked down, brushing her daughter's soft curls away from her face. Yeah, sweetheart. The little girl hesitated, eyes full of innocent curiosity. That man was nice, even when they weren't. The mother felt a lump in her throat, because she knew. This moment was shaping her child's world. Yes, baby, he was. The little girl scrunched her nose. Why were they mean to him? Her mother sighed. choosing her words carefully. Because some people think they're better than others. The little girl frowned. But they're not. The mother smiled softly. No, sweetheart, they're not. She took her daughter's small hand, squeezing it gently. That's why you always choose kindness. The little girl nodded, her small face set with a new kind of understanding. And just like that, the lesson was passed forward. Outside, in the parking lot, a different kind of silence filled the air. Trent and Vanessa sat inside their car, parked near the front. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them even moved. They just sat there, the weight of everything that had just happened pressing down on them like a heavy, suffocating fog. Vanessa stared ahead, hands clenched in her lap. Her reflection in the windshield looked foreign to her, like she didn't recognize herself anymore. Her perfect, polished world had cracked, and there was no way to put it back together. Trent gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. His whole life, he had been the man in control, the man people looked up to, admired, feared. But back there, he had been nothing. Back there, he had been small. And Shaq had been the better man. And for the first time, Trent had no words, because there was nothing left to say. The memory of that day had faded from most people's minds, buried beneath the endless cycle of daily life. But not for the people who had been there. And definitely not for Trent. Shaq stepped through the automatic doors of Merrick's Market, the cool air conditioning hitting him instantly. He hadn't planned to come back here. This was just a quick stop on his way home. But as he walked inside, something felt different. The energy, the atmosphere, it had shifted. As he moved toward the produce section, he heard someone clear their throat behind him. Shaq turned. Standing there, wearing a store manager's name tag, was Jake, the young cashier from that day. Only now he carried himself differently, more confident, more sure of himself. He smiled, a little nervous but grateful. Mr. Johnson. Shaq raised an eyebrow, smirking. Didn't know I had fans. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. I wanted to thank you. Shaq crossed his arms. For what? Jake's smile faltered slightly, as if he wasn't sure how to say it. Then, after a beat, he found the words. For showing me what standing up for what's right looks like. Shaq studied him for a moment. There was something real in his voice. Something that said that day had changed him. Shaq just nodded. You're a good kid, Jake. You didn't need me to show you that. Jake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Maybe. But I needed to see it. He glanced around the store. A lot of people did. Shaq let the words settle. Then he gave Jake a firm pat on the shoulder. Make sure you do something with it. Shaq turned to leave, but then he saw him, standing near the bread aisle, picking up a plain loaf of white bread, wearing a simple hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. No blazer, no designer watch, no smirk, just Trent. Shaq paused, watching. Trent hadn't seen him yet, and even when he finally did, he didn't hold eye contact. He shifted on his feet, cleared his throat, glanced down like a man carrying something heavy. For the first time, he didn't look like someone who had all the answers. He looked like someone who had been forced to find new ones. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Trent stepped forward. Not confident, not smug, just human. He exhaled, eyes flickering to Shaq's face for a fraction of a second before dropping again. And then quietly, almost painfully, he muttered, I was wrong. Shaq didn't flinch, didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He just let the words hang there. Then, after a moment, he nodded. See that you don't forget it. Trent swallowed, giving a small nod before stepping back. Shaq didn't need to say anything else, because the lesson had already been taught, and Trent would never forget it. As Shaq turned and walked toward the exit, the automatic doors slid open. The cool breeze hit his face. He didn't look back, but the camera did. It lingered on Trent, standing in the exact spot where he once laughed. But now he wasn't laughing. Now he was just thinking. Forever changed. They laughed at him. He humbled them with kindness. This isn't just a story. It's a lesson in power, privilege, and the impact of a single moment. If you love stories that expose arrogance, serve justice in unexpected ways, and leave you thinking long after they end, you're in the right place. Follow for more gripping, thought-provoking stories that turn the tables on prejudice and prove that real strength comes from character, not status.